So last week we started a series on identity. We're talking about a question of who am I? And I shared about how who we are is found in whose we are. And the answer doesn't come from just what we do, what other people say about us, or what we have, but rather what God has done for us, what God says about us, and what we have with God. Today I want to focus on what God has done for you and I. But first of all, I want to talk about a story of a time that I made a mistake. We all make mistakes, and maybe you've made an embarrassing mistake like the one I'm going to share with you. I was going to share somewhere, similar to sort of what I'm doing up the front right now. I had to go somewhere. It was actually a little bit far away, and I was driving there. As I was driving, you know that feeling in your gut, and you're just like, oh boy, something I've eaten is not agreeing with me at all. And as I started driving, that feeling started getting stronger and stronger. And I was like, oh boy, am I going to make it? I remember rocking up this place and legging it through the front door of this building. Before I saw anyone, I saw that there was a toilet door, a toilet sign. I raced to the toilet sign. Sorry, if you don't like toilet stories, I apologize, but we're just getting stuck into it. I raced in. There was a few cubicles, but I raced into one. I did my business, etc., and it was all good. And then I turned around and I looked at the toilet. I looked at where I was going to flush. But the issue was there was no flush button. The whole top of the back of the toilet was gone. And so I'm thinking, like, how do I flush it? And I started becoming like a toilet mechanic. I started using the toilet brush that was down there, started just whacking things, hoping that something would flush at the top there, but it wouldn't flush. And I'm freaking out. I'm like, what do I do? So I walked out of the toilet, just trying to, out of the cubicle, seeing if I could find something else. And I turned around and I looked at my toilet door, and it had a big out of order sign. And I'm like, oh, you're kidding me. What am I going to do? Now, a couple thoughts crossed my mind. I was like, do I just leave it there? Like, do I just go and no one will ever know? But I was actually the ironic thing is I was going to this place to speak on humility. And I'm like, I'm speaking on humility. I can't just leave a mess in the toilet and be on my way. And then I'm thinking, do I move it into one of the other toilets? And that came through for 1 second. I was like, that is the most disgusting thing that ever came in my mind. My gut wasn't feeling good. It wasn't going to be a good result at all. And so I was freaking out. And I'm like, what do I do? And I just think, I'm like, all right, it's bad, but I'm just going to walk out. I'm just going to pretend like nothing happened. So I walk out of the toilets. And as I take about 2 steps, I walk into the person that I was going to chat to before I spoke. And this is literally, kid you not, his words. He's like, hi, Matt. And he must have just noticed the look on my face. And his words were, oh, did you just use the out of order toilet? And I was like, what? How did you know? I was absolutely ashamed. And then I don't actually know what happened. Someone had to clean that toilet. Poor person. But I remember just thinking to myself, I'm going to be remembered as the guy that came and spoke that made a mess in their broken toilet. Really embarrassing. Sometimes we make mistakes in our lives like that, maybe unintentional, maybe a bit stupid. But sometimes we also make mistakes that involve our own wrongdoing. I don't know if you've got that little brother or sister that is just so annoying, and instead of ignoring them, you decide to snap and maybe give them a good crack on the shoulder or say something maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you hear about that story about someone, that negative story, and you think, oh, I'd love to tell someone else about that. Or maybe we get a little bit selfish and we see someone else's food and we go, oh, I would love that. I live with my wife, Jazz now, just us. It's actually her birthday today, so she loves attention, so I thought I'd bring that to attention. But you buy a 4-pack of ice creams, and the unwritten rule is that it's 2 each. But I'm always tempted to eat the third one, and I sometimes do eat the third one. I feel like a bad person. But when I used to live with my 2 brothers, you could eat as many as you want. You just blame the other brother. It was fine. But when you live with 2 people, there's no one to blame but yourself. I talk about these somewhat littler things, but we can also look in our world, and there's so many messed up things, mistakes, evil in our world. We can look and just see on social media, on the news, etc., see the fighting, see the war, stories of sexual assault, stories of incredibly bad things that people are doing to each other. And we think to ourselves, what is going on with the world? But sometimes we think to ourselves, at least I'm not like that person. We compare ourselves. At least I've only done so-and-so. In the Bible, in Romans 3:23, I want to give a little bit of perspective about this. It says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. You and I, we all mess up. Compared to God, we don't measure up. We are all people in need of forgiveness. The Bible uses this word sin that you may have heard but may have not heard before. Talks about some of the mistakes we make as sinner. We naturally act in selfishness against others, even sometimes against our own health. We hurt other people, we hurt ourselves. Sin is a tricky word, but simply to fail, to miss the goal. And on a Saturday, I miss plenty of goals when I'm playing church basketball, but this is not the goal that it's talking about. It's talking about the goal of loving God and loving others, God's command for us. We can see in the Old Testament the 10 Commandments broken up in half of them is to love God and to love others. But what do? We act for our own benefit at the expense of others. Sometimes we don't even realize it. One way we do it is we redefine what good and bad is. We often excuse it or we justify what we're doing. And we can see in history people that have justified some really terrible things thinking that it was actually a good thing. But maybe you're thinking, when I'm saying this, you're thinking, so what? What does it matter if I do these things? I want to say tonight that sin has consequences. It has many effects. Just like any other injustice, just like anything else, it causes injustice. It causes a break in trust in relationships. We think about the environment, how we pollute the environment. But when we sin, we actually pollute our own selves and our relationships. There's a separation between us and God. And whether we know it or not, that we can actually, whether you know God or not, we can see the effect of sin in our lives. We idolize other things. We put them ahead of God. We pursue fame. We pursue approval of other people. And what do we end up? We end up insecure, unsatisfied. We gossip. We engage in gossip. We engage with lying. What does that involve? It involves in the breaking of trust and breaking of relationships. We can see the effect of cheating on a family, breaking apart a family. We can see the effect of pornography on our society and seeing how people are objectified and influences how we actually treat other people. We treat them as an object with unrealistic expectations around relationships, and it causes much shame. We want to see justice for many bad things that are done in our life, but our sin actually deserves punishment. It actually causes a separation between us and God. We can't have something imperfect with something perfect. It causes a disconnection from God who gives life. So therefore, if we don't have life, the penalty of death is sin. And sometimes we can think about the worst mistake that we have ever made. Maybe it's a mistake that you've made that has changed the way people thought or treated you. We can let that be our identity. That's how we see ourselves. We hear about it all the time, labels: the liar, the gossiper, the thief, the adulterer, the murderer, the greedy person. And what I've said here is pretty heavy and it's pretty dark. But the thing is, we all need forgiveness. Each one of us stuffs up. We all mess up. I'm no different from any of you guys. We all need forgiveness. But what is so amazing is that is where Jesus comes in. I want you to think to yourself, what is the greatest thing that someone has ever done for you? Maybe some things come to mind, and I'm not thinking just like little things. Like I used to have this friend that worked at Macca's, and so I'd go through the drive-thru all the time, and I'd order hotcakes, and he'd give me like 9 hotcakes instead of 3 hotcakes, or he'd chuck in a free large chips all the time, and I thought that was like one of the greatest things ever. I could get free Macca's from my mate. But there's something amazing what Jesus has done for us. So I want to share a story. There was in World War II, there was a group of prisoners. They were called prisoners of war. So essentially they had been captured by Japan, and they were sent to Burma to work on this railway during World War II, and it was horrific conditions. They didn't get enough food. They were treated horribly. They were forced into manual labour. And one day, as these group of prisoners were working on this railway, all of a sudden there's this massive commotion, and these soldiers start running at these prisoners, yelling and screaming. They were yelling and shouting because one of the shovels was missing. The soldiers were demanding that the prisoner who had stolen or hidden it to come forward. In broken English, they were yelling, "Step forward." But no one stepped forward. And then one of them started to get their gun ready and started lining it up at the prisoners, saying, "All die, all die." Literally, just as the soldier was about to start shooting the whole group of prisoners, one guy stepped forward. As he stepped forward, the soldiers surrounded him, had their rifles, and beat him to death. Incredibly horrific scene for the group of other prisoners. And they got back to camp. All of the shovels were recounted, and it was found that none were missing. The anonymous soldier sacrificed his life so that his companions could live. This is so much what Jesus has done for us on the cross. Jesus paid the ultimate price to forgive us and to set us free. At Access on Tuesday nights, we've been running Alpha out in the hall, 7 to 8:30. I encourage you, anyone is welcome to come along. And the other week, they gave this really great analogy around it. It was around the passage Isaiah 53:6. We all like sheep have gone astray. Some of you know that song. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity or the sin of us all. And it shares this analogy. This is us and Jesus in our lives. And this book represents all the sin, all the mistakes that we make. As you can see, it causes a separation between us and God. But this is Jesus on the other hand. Jesus on the cross actually took what says all our iniquities, all the mistakes, all the things that we messed up, that he took it in our place. And now we see the result, that he has taken it for us, that we're actually free to actually have a relationship with Jesus, that we are forgiven. Where does that leave us? That Jesus took our sins, defeating death. Our penalty, our guilt was removed. Our debt was paid for once and for all. No matter what we've done, no matter what we do in the future, that Jesus has paid for our mistakes. That our identity is not found in our mistakes, but in his forgiveness. If we believe in Jesus, you are forgiven. When we say yes to Jesus, we can have a weight of our shoulders. That the things we've done in our past are not what define us. There are still consequences for our mistakes, our sin, but that does not define us. That does not separate us from God. We are called to focus on our forgiveness, not our failure. Knowing that we are already forgiven actually helps us not to fall into the trap again. When we sin, when we make mistakes, sometimes we can feel shame for the bad things that we've done in our lives. I don't know if you've ever got dirty. Once you get dirty, when you dirty your shoes, you don't really care if your shoes get even more dirty in that moment. Sometimes that's the same with shame. We can feel that shame and we can really fall into the trap of messing up more and more and wallow in that. But I want to say tonight that you are not your last mistake. You are not defined by the worst thing that you've ever done. You believe in Jesus, that you are forgiven. But how then do we experience this forgiveness? Well, in 1 John 1:9 it says, "If we confess our sins, he is faithful and he will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness." All we have to do is to receive, to confess, to give those things to God and believe in him. And forgiveness is available to us. Do we live and act as those forgiven? When we know our forgiveness, it changes how we act. To finish, I want to make one last point, is that we are actually called to forgive others as we have been forgiven. When we know that we are forgiven, when that God forgives us, it helps us to forgive others. In Ephesians 4:32, it says, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ, God, forgave you." You are called to forgive others. Boy, is that hard to take sometimes. The idea of forgiveness, I don't know what sort of emotions that brings up when we're told to forgive others. Maybe you think to yourself, you don't know what someone's done to me. But what Jesus is saying here is forgiveness is in our best interests. I love this quote, and I've shared it before, is unforgiveness is like drinking poison and hoping that the other person will die. Unforgiveness causes bitterness. When we hold on to it, we're actually not hurting that other person. The most affected person is actually ourselves. But when I share about forgiveness, forgiveness is not trying to downplay what someone has done to you. When we forgive, we need to acknowledge the hurt that someone has caused us. It's not forgetting what they did, and putting yourself in that position again. But forgiveness is giving up the right to be angry, to be resenting towards them, knowing that it actually might bring up a fair bit of hurt immediately when we actually start the process of forgiveness. But it's actually the first step to emotional healing. That when we actually forgive, that we can actually get to a place where we wish the best for someone else. If God has forgiven you, then God can actually forgive that other person as well. And sometimes in our relationships, we can get really stuck when there's hurt on either side of the relationship. Someone's hurt you, you've hurt them. And it's almost at a stalemate. And I pulled up to a roundabout a few weeks ago, and there was 3 points. And as I pulled up, 2 other cars pulled up at the exact same time. As we pulled up, we sort of just stopped. Like we all gave way to your right? Yeah. We all gave way. Whoever's studying for L's, you can answer that better. We all gave way, and so we just stopped. And we just waited there. We waited for someone to make the first step. And eventually I started, which allowed that person to start, which allowed that person to start. And we were able to go on our way. And sometimes that's what, in our relationships, in forgiveness, that it takes someone to take the first step. Would you be willing to take that first step? I just want to finish with one last story. A story of forgiveness. An incredible story. There was during World War II, I've got a couple World War II stories tonight, but during World War II, if you were a Jew, it was not a great place to be if you were anywhere near Germany. And in Netherlands, they were taken over by Germany, and there was this family of Jews on this street that had to go into hiding, and they hid in their neighbour's attic, the Stein family. So there was a next door neighbour, and the next door's neighbour was named Ivan. And Ivan had just joined the Nazi party, and so he suspected that there was someone living in his next door neighbour's house. And so he ended up befriending this family that was looking after them. And he ended up finding out, yes, there was this family, the Stein family, that were living in the attic. And so he ended up reporting them to the German soldiers. And the German soldiers one day came around, and Ivan was looking out the window, and as these soldiers came in, they dragged out this family of Jews, the Stein family, and they ended up, Ivan watched as one of the soldiers shot the father in the head and killed him in that instant. This family was taken away, and Ivan reflected on it a few years later that this family never came back. And the reason that they never came back is that they were taken and put into a concentration camp. And actually all of them passed away apart from the youngest daughter, Rachel. And Rachel ended up surviving this camp, and the war finished, and ended up years later straight away moving to USA. And years later, time went on, but she was still processing this. Time had passed, but she held this resentment and anger for her neighbour Ivan, for giving them up, and for this soldier who had actually shot her father in the head. And she held on to this anger deep, and it affected her. She was overwhelmed with bitterness. She struggled in other relationships in her life. And then one day she came to know Jesus, the love that she found that her father had for her, that she found out that she was forgiven. And this led in a certain time period to actually learn to actually be able to forgive Ivan and the soldier. Even though she didn't know if they were still alive or had seen them since, she actually forgave them. And she shared this story with a couple of people. They ended up encouraging her to share it with a few other people, and she ended up sharing it to this large group of people. And this newspaper picked this up decades after the war, and ended up that someone in her hometown in the Netherlands found out about what had happened, this incredible story of forgiveness. And when this newspaper ran it, Ivan's brother actually heard about it and actually shared it with Ivan. And Ivan was amazed. All these years he had this guilt and this shame of what he had done to this family. And he was amazed to hear of Rachel's forgiveness. A few weeks later, Rachel was actually invited back to the Netherlands to share her story of forgiveness. And after all the crowd had dissipated, Ivan was actually there listening. Ivan went up to Rachel. And as they walked up to each other, Ivan was like, I don't know if she's going to forgive me, she's going to hate me, she's been saying these things. But they actually met each other and no words were spoken. They just embraced. And for both of them, tears were rolling down their eyes. So this didn't just help Ivan's life, but Rachel, this idea of letting go and actually forgiving. It impacted both of their lives. through Jesus, we are forgiven. We are not our worst mistake. We are not the last thing that we did wrong. We are called to focus on his forgiveness, not our failures. Knowing in life that we're always going to make mistakes, but we can actually turn to Jesus who forgives us. He actually helps us to consider what it would look like to forgive others. So I just like to pray to finish, and I just encourage you just to stand to your feet. We're going to sing.